The morning sun cast long shadows across the military shooting range as Private Marcus Thompson adjusted his red tunic and straightened his tall black bearskin hat. At 28, he had been serving as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace for 3 years now, a position that filled him with immense pride. Today was different, though. Today, he wasn't standing at attention outside the palace gates or marching in ceremonial formation. Today, he was at the annual inter-service shooting competition, representing the household division. Marcus had volunteered for this event, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he missed the feeling of holding a rifle for something other than ceremony. Maybe it was because he wanted to prove that the royal guards were more than just tourist attractions in fancy uniforms. Or maybe, deep down, it was because he needed to remember who he used to be before the red coat and the silent vigil. The shooting range buzzed with activity. As soldiers from different units prepared their equipment, Marcus could hear the conversations around him, and his heart sank a little with each comment. A group of paratroopers were laughing loudly near the ammunition table, their voices carrying across the range. "Look at that," one of them said, pointing in Marcus's direction. "They sent a toy soldier to a real competition. Probably thinks his rifle is just for show," another added. Causing the group to burst into laughter, Marcus pretended not to hear, focusing instead on checking his weapon. He had requested a standard military rifle for the competition, leaving his ceremonial weapon back at the barracks. The familiar weight of the gun in his hands brought back memories he had carefully tucked away. A sergeant from the Royal Marines approached the group of paratroopers, shaking his head with amusement. "I heard they're desperate for participants. These days, if they're bringing palace guards," he said loud enough for Marcus to hear. "What's next? Having the Queen's corgis compete in the obstacle course?" The laughter grew louder, and Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He had expected some ribbing, but this was worse than he had anticipated. To them, he wasn't a soldier. It was a decoration. A living statue whose only job was to look pretty for tourists and stand perfectly still while children tried to make him smile. "Hey, guard," one of the paratroopers called out. "You sure you know which end of that rifle to hold? Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself?" Marcus looked up briefly, meeting the soldier's eyes for just a moment before returning to his preparations. He said nothing, but inside, something stirred. Something he had been suppressing for 3 years. A young corporal from the infantry wandered over, genuine curiosity in his expression. "I've got to ask, mate," he said, his tone less mocking than the others, but still condescending. "What made you think you could compete with actual combat soldiers? I mean, no offense, but don't you guys just march around and pose for pictures?" Marcus finished loading his rifle and stood up slowly. The corporal was waiting for an answer, and the other soldiers had quieted down, interested in hearing what the ceremonial guard would say. "I suppose we'll see," Marcus replied quietly, his voice steady and calm. This response only seemed to amuse the crowd more. "We'll see," one of the Marines repeated mockingly. "Did you hear that, lads? The palace guard thinks he's got a chance?" Older Sergeant Major from the artillery unit shook his head with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Son," he said to Marcus, "this isn't a parade ground. These are real shooters here. Men who've been in combat, who've trained for years in marksmanship. You might want to consider withdrawing before you embarrass yourself and your unit." Marcus nodded politely at the Sergeant Major. "I appreciate the concern, sir, but I think I'll give it a try." The competition was organized into several rounds, starting with basic marksmanship at various distances, then moving to more complex scenarios involving moving targets and time constraints. As the competitors gathered for the first round, the jokes continued. "I bet he's never even fired a shot outside of basic training," whispered a sniper from the SBS. "Look at him," said another. "He's probably more worried about getting his uniform dirty than hitting the target." Marcus took his position at the firing line, and the range fell silent as the first round began. The targets were set at 300 meters, and each shooter had 10 rounds to achieve the best possible score. The wind was minimal, conditions were good, and Marcus felt something awakening inside him as he settled into position, as he lay prone behind his rifle. Adjusting the scope and feeling the familiar grip, memories began to surface. Memories of a different time, a different uniform, a different life. But he pushed them down. Not yet, not until it was time. The first few competitors took their turns, achieving respectable scores. The paratroopers performed well, as expected. With most hitting between 7 and 9 points per shot, the Marines did even better, with their sniper achieving a near-perfect score of 94 out of 100. When Marcus's turn came, the snickering resumed. "Watch this," someone whispered. 10 quid. Says he misses the target completely on at least half his shots. Marcus settled into position, his breathing automatically falling into the rhythm he had learned so many years ago. The scope crosshairs found the target, and time seemed to slow down. This was muscle memory, instinct, training that went deeper than the red tunic and the ceremonial duties. He fired his first shot. The electronic scoring system. He immediately displayed the result. A perfect 10. The range fell silent for a moment, then someone said, "Lucky shot." Marcus fired again. Another 10. By the time he had fired all 10 rounds, the silence on the range was complete, except for the electronic beeping of the scoring system. 10 perfect shots. 100 points. A perfect score. The range officer called out the result, his voice betraying his own surprise. "Thompson, Royal Guard. Perfect score, 100 points." The soldiers around Marcus stared in stunned silence. This wasn't possible. This had to be a fluke, a series of lucky shots that would never be repeated. Palace guards didn't shoot like this. They couldn't shoot like this. But as Marcus stood up and began preparing for the second round, something in his posture had changed. The embarrassment was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that made some of the other competitors uncomfortable. "Must be the rifle," one of the paratroopers muttered. "He probably zeroed perfectly for this range." "Yeah," agreed another. "See him do it again with a different weapon." But even as they made their excuses, there was something in Marcus Thompson's eyes now that hadn't been there before. Something that suggested this perfect score was no accident, and that the mild-mannered Royal Guard they had been mocking might be hiding depths they couldn't begin to imagine. The second round was about to begin, and Marcus was just getting started. The second round brought new challenges and fresh skepticism from the other competitors. The targets were now set at 500 meters, and each shooter would face moving targets that appeared at random intervals. This wasn't just about accuracy anymore. It was about quick target acquisition, leading moving objects, and maintaining precision under pressure. Marcus watched as the first few shooters took their turns. The paratroopers struggled with the increased distance and moving targets, managing scores in the 70s and low 80s. Even the confident Marines found the challenge more difficult than expected, with their best shooter managing an 86. "This is where the Palace Guard falls apart," predicted the sergeant major, who had tried to convince Marcus to withdraw. "Moving targets require real training, real experience. Not the kind of thing you learn standing still outside a palace." The corporal who had questioned Marcus earlier was nodding in agreement. "Exactly. Anyone can get lucky with stationary targets, but this requires actual skill, combat experience." Marcus remained quiet, methodically checking his equipment as he had done before. But something had shifted in the atmosphere around him. His perfect score in the first round had created a tension that hung over the range like morning fog. The other soldiers were no longer quite as loud with their jokes, though they still maintained their skeptical comments. A lieutenant from the Royal Engineers approached Marcus with what seemed like genuine interest. "That was impressive shooting in the first round," he said. "Where did you train? Before joining the guards." "Various places," Marcus replied simply, not looking up from his rifle maintenance. The lieutenant waited for more information. But when none came, he pressed on. "It's just that kind of precision usually comes from specialized training. Sniper school, maybe?" Marcus finally looked up, meeting the lieutenant's eyes briefly. "Something like that." This cryptic response only added to the growing curiosity about the quiet. It's a Royal Guard. But before anyone could ask more questions, the range officer called for the next shooter. When Marcus's turn came, he approached the firing line with the same calm demeanor he had shown before. But those watching carefully might have noticed subtle differences in how he moved, how he carried himself. There was an efficiency to his movements, a purposefulness that spoke of extensive training. He settled into position, and the electronic system activated the moving targets. Unlike the stationary targets from the first round, these metal silhouettes would slide across rails at varying speeds, appearing from behind barriers at unpredictable intervals. The first target emerged from the left, moving at moderate speed. Marcus's rifle swung smoothly to track it, and he fired without apparent hesitation. The target stopped immediately, struck dead center. "Good shot," admitted one of the Marines grudgingly, but Marcus was already tracking the second target, which had appeared from the right at a much faster speed. Again, his shot was perfectly timed, striking the target with precision that made several of the watching soldiers exchange glances. By the time the electronic timer signaled the end of his turn, Marcus had engaged 12 moving targets of varying speeds and directions. All 12 shots were kills, with most striking center mass or head. Shots that would have been instantly fatal in combat. The silence that followed was different from the first round. This wasn't just surprise anymore. It was the beginning of recognition. The kind of shooting they had just witnessed didn't come from casual training or lucky guesses. This was the work of someone who had done this before, many times, under conditions far more stressful than a friendly competition. The range officer's voice broke the silence. "Thompson, Royal Guard. Perfect score, 120 points." Young private from the infantry voiced what many were thinking. "That's not possible. Nobody shoots that well without serious training. I mean, really serious training." The sergeant major who had earlier suggested Marcus's withdrawal was staring at him with new interest. "Son," he said slowly, "I think there's more to you than meets the eye." Marcus began packing up his equipment, his movements still calm and methodical. "Just lucky, I suppose," he said quietly. But the corporal who had questioned him earlier wasn't buying it anymore. "Lucky doesn't cover what we just saw. That was professional level shooting, military professional." Captain from the Royal Artillery had been watching quietly from the sidelines, and now he stepped forward. "Thompson, isn't it?" he said. "That's some impressive marksmanship. Mind if I ask what your background is before the guards?" Marcus paused in his equipment check. "Served in other capacities before my current posting, sir." "Other capacities," the captain repeated thoughtfully. "Would those capacities have involved specialized training? The kind that produces shooting like what we just witnessed?" Before Marcus could answer, the range officer announced the third round. This would be the most challenging yet. Precision shooting at extreme range, 800 meters. With wind conditions that would test even experienced snipers, the mood on the range had shifted significantly. The jokes had stopped completely, replaced by a growing respect mixed with intense curiosity. Marcus Thompson was no longer seen as an amusing diversion or an easy target for mockery. He was now viewed as a serious competitor, possibly the most serious they faced, as the other shooters prepared for the extreme range challenge. Conversations began in hushed tones. Groups of soldiers gathered, discussing what they had witnessed, and trying to piece together the mystery of the Royal Guard who shot like a Special Forces operative. "I've seen shooting like that before," said the SBS sniper to his companion. "But not from regular infantry. That's specialized training, advanced stuff." The Marine sergeant nodded. "I'm thinking exactly. Question is, what kind of specialized training, and why is someone with those skills standing guard at a palace?" Marcus overheard some of these conversations, but remained focused on his preparations. The third round would be the most difficult, requiring not just accuracy but also an understanding of ballistics, wind compensation, and atmospheric conditions. These were skills that took years to develop and constant practice to maintain. As he checked his scope settings and calculated wind drift, muscle memory took over. He found himself automatically adjusting for factors that most soldiers never learned to consider. Knowledge was still there, buried beneath 3 years of ceremonial duties, but as sharp as ever. The first few shooters in the extreme range round struggled significantly. Even the experienced snipers found the conditions challenging, with scores dropping into the 60s and 70s. The wind was tricky, shifting directions subtly. The distance made even small errors in calculation result in complete misses. When his turn came, Marcus approached the firing line with the same quiet confidence he had shown before. But now, every eye on the range was focused on him. The mockery was gone, replaced by intense curiosity and growing respect. He settled into position, his breathing falling into the deep, controlled rhythm that sniper training had burned into his nervous system. Through the scope, the target looked impossibly small at 800 meters. But as he began his calculations, adjusting for wind, humidity, and the slight angle of the shot, everything felt familiar, natural, like coming home after a long absence. The first shot rang out across the range, and everyone held their breath as they waited for the spotting scope to reveal the result. When the range officer's voice came over the speakers announcing another perfect hit, the silence was complete. Marcus was no longer just a royal guard who could shoot well. He was beginning to look like something else entirely, something that would explain everything they had witnessed, if only they could figure out what it was. As he prepared for his second shot at the extreme range, Marcus Thompson felt the last of his ceremonial reserve beginning to crack. The skills he had spent 3 years suppressing were demanding to be acknowledged. The question was whether he was ready to let them. The extreme range round continued, and with each perfect shot from Marcus, the atmosphere on the range grew more tense. By the time he completed his 10 shots at 800 meters, achieving another perfect score, the other competitors weren't just curious anymore, they were deeply unsettled. A colonel from the parachute regiment, who had been observing from the range command post, made his way down to the firing line. His expression was serious, the kind of look that came from years of evaluating soldiers and recognizing when something didn't add up. "Private Thompson," the colonel said, his voice carrying the authority of rank and experience. "That was extraordinary. Shooting. In 30 years of military service, I've rarely seen precision like that outside of very specialized units." Marcus stood at attention, as he had been trained to do when addressed by senior officers. "Thank you, sir." The colonel studied him carefully. "I'm curious about your military history, Private. Your file shows you joined the Household Division directly from basic training 3 years ago. But the skills you've demonstrated today suggest a much more extensive background." Several other soldiers had gathered around, drawn by the colonel's presence and the implication of his questions. Marcus remained at attention, his expression neutral, but those watching closely could see a slight tension in his jaw. "I had some additional training before my current posting, sir," Marcus replied carefully. "Additional training," the colonel repeated. "Would this additional training have been with specialized units? Perhaps units whose records might be classified?" Duh. Question hung in the air like smoke from a rifle barrel.
Alice.
Everyone on the range understood the implication. There were units in the British military whose members' histories were often obscured or classified for security reasons. Units that produced exactly the kind of shooting they had just witnessed. A major from the Royal Marines stepped forward. "Colonel, if I may," he said, "I've worked with various Special Forces units over the years. What we've seen today isn't just good marksmanship. It's the kind of precision that comes from operational experience. Real-world application under pressure." Marcus remained silent, but something flickered in his eyes. For just a moment, the carefully maintained facade of the ceremonial guard cracked, revealing something harder underneath. The SBS sniper who had been watching throughout the competition approached the group. "Sir," he said to the colonel, "I've been observing Private Thompson's technique. His breathing patterns, his target acquisition speed, the way he compensates for wind. These are advanced sniper techniques, not the kind of thing they teach in basic infantry training." The colonel nodded slowly. "My thoughts exactly, Sergeant. The question is, Private Thompson, are you going to enlighten us about where you acquired these skills?" Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. Soldiers from elite units, experienced combat veterans, men who had dedicated their careers to military excellence. 3 years ago, he had been one of them. More than one of them, if truth were told. But that life was supposed to be behind him. "I'd prefer not to discuss my previous service, sir," Marcus said quietly. This response only intensified the speculation. A warrant officer from the SAS selection training cadre, who had been watching from a distance, walked over to join the group. It dumped. His presence changed the dynamic immediately. Everyone knew that SAS personnel had an eye for recognizing their own kind. Interesting shooting today, the warrant officer said to Marcus, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Very interesting indeed. Reminds me of some lads I've worked with over the years. Marcus met the warrant officer's gaze steadily. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Those watching felt they were witnessing some kind of silent communication. The fourth round was announced. Tactical shooting with multiple targets at varying distances, simulating a combat engagement. Shooters would have to transition between positions, engage targets in a specific sequence, and do it all against the clock. This was the kind of scenario that separated sport shooters from combat-trained soldiers. As the competitors prepared for this new challenge, the conversations around Marcus became more direct. The pretense of casual curiosity was gone, replaced by frank speculation about his background. "He's regiment," said the Marine major quietly to the colonel. "Has to be. Nobody else shoots like that." Or SBS suggested the sniper. "Some of their lads are phenomenal marksmen." The warrant officer from SAS selection overheard these comments. "Could be either," he said, "or could be something else entirely. There are units most people don't even know exist." Marcus was checking his equipment for the tactical round, but he could hear every word. The careful anonymity he had maintained for 3 years was crumbling with each perfect shot. Soon questions would be asked that he couldn't deflect with vague answers. The tactical round began, and the first few shooters struggled with the complexity of the scenario. Moving between positions while maintaining accuracy was difficult enough, but doing it quickly while engaging multiple targets in sequence proved beyond most of their capabilities. When Marcus's turn came, something extraordinary happened. As soon as the timer started, his entire demeanor changed. Gone was the reserved, polite royal guard. In his place was a tactical operator, moving with fluid efficiency from position to position, engaging targets with mechanical precision. He flowed through the course like water, each movement economical and purposeful. His transitions between shooting positions were textbook perfect, and his target engagement was so fast that the electronic scoring system struggled to keep up. When the timer stopped, he had completed the course in a time that was significantly faster than any other competitor. With perfect accuracy on all targets, the silence that followed was different from the previous rounds. This wasn't just about marksmanship anymore. What they had witnessed was tactical proficiency at the highest level, the kind that only came from extensive training and real-world experience in high-stress environments. The colonel walked over to Marcus, his expression now openly curious. "Private Thompson," he said, "I think it's time you told us who you really are." Marcus looked around at the faces watching him. Soldiers who had spent the morning mocking him now looked at him with respect and intense curiosity. The secret he had guarded for 3 years was pushing against the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. "Sir," he said carefully, "some things are better left in the past." But the warrant officer from SAS selection stepped closer. "Son," he said quietly, "nobody learns to move like that from basic training. Nobody maintains those skills working ceremonial duties. So the question is, what were you before you put on that red tunic?" Marcus felt the weight of 3 years of carefully maintained silence pressing down on him. He had joined the household division to escape his past, to find peace in the ceremony and tradition of palace duty. But his old skills had betrayed him. Today, revealing themselves despite his best efforts to keep them buried, the 5th round was about to begin. And Marcus knew that each additional demonstration of his abilities would make it harder to maintain his anonymity. But he had come too far to stop now. The competition was almost over, and with it, perhaps, his ability to remain just another royal guard, as he prepared for the next challenge. Marcus Thompson realized that his past was about to catch up with him, whether he wanted it to or not. The 5th round introduced an element that changed everything: stress shooting under simulated combat conditions. The range had been modified to include smoke, loud noises, and time pressure that would test not just shooting skills but mental resilience and training under extreme stress. Marcus watched as the first competitors attempted the course. Even experienced soldiers found their accuracy deteriorating under the artificial stress conditions. Heart rates increased, breathing became irregular, and precision suffered. Scores dropped dramatically as the pressure mounted. A captain from the intelligence corps, who had been quietly observing throughout the competition, approached the growing group of officers around Marcus. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I think we need to consider that Private Thompson might be someone whose identity requires protection." The colonel looked at the intelligence corps captain with interest, meaning that some of our most valuable assets maintain cover identities for their own protection and operational security. The kind of skills we've witnessed today don't just disappear when someone leaves special operations. His comment sent a ripple through the gathered soldiers. The possibility that Marcus wasn't just a former Special Forces soldier, but someone whose true identity was classified for security reasons, added a new dimension to the mystery. Marcus heard these conversations, but remained focused on his preparations. The stress shooting round would be the most challenging yet, not because of the technical difficulty, but because it would trigger responses and training that he had worked hard to suppress. When his name was called, Marcus approached the starting line with visible reluctance for the first time that day. The stress shooting course would demand that he access parts of his training that were deeply buried, parts that carried memories he had spent 3 years trying to forget. The course began with a klaxon that immediately triggered something primal. In Marcus's nervous system, his heart rate increased, but instead of hampering his performance, it seemed to sharpen his focus. As smoke began filling the air and recorded gunfire played through speakers around the range, Marcus moved into the course like a man returning to his natural environment. What happened next was unlike anything the watching soldiers had seen, even from elite unit members. Marcus didn't just complete the stress course, he dominated it, moving through smoke and chaos, engaging targets while under simulated enemy fire. He performed with a level of precision and speed that suggested this scenario was more familiar to him than the peaceful ceremony of palace duty. His movements were those of someone who had operated under real stress. Real danger, real bullets. The artificial conditions of the range course paled in comparison to whatever experiences had shaped his training. He flowed through the obstacles and targets like a predator in familiar territory. When the course ended and the smoke cleared, Marcus stood at the finish line breathing normally, his weapon lowered and safe, every target eliminated with precise shots. The electronic scoring system showed another perfect score, but more importantly, a completion time that was nearly 30% faster than the previous best. The silence that followed was profound. Even the warrant officer from SAS Selection looked impressed, and that was not an easy thing to accomplish. The colonel approached Marcus slowly, its expression now showing genuine respect mixed with deep curiosity. "Private Thompson," he said, "what we just witnessed wasn't just good training. That was operational experience. Real-world experience under genuine stress conditions." The stress course had awakened responses that were difficult to suppress again. His bearing was more alert, more tactical, less ceremonial. "Sir," he replied, "I've had some challenging assignments in the past." "Closer. Private. I think we need to discuss this privately. There may be security considerations at play here." But before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Well, Marcus Thompson. He was middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, but he moved with the same quiet confidence that Marcus had displayed during the tactical shooting. More importantly, Marcus's entire demeanor changed when he saw the man. "Hello, David," Marcus said quietly, and for the first time that day, his careful composure cracked completely. The man called David smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. 3 years of silence, and then you turn up. At a shooting competition, displaying skills that are supposed to be forgotten, the soldiers around them exchanged glances. This civilian clearly knew Marcus's true background, and his presence was no coincidence. David looked around at the gathered military personnel. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying an authority that had nothing to do with military rank, "I'm afraid Private Thompson's participation in your competition has raised some security concerns." The colonel stepped forward. "And you are?" "Someone who takes a professional interest in soldiers with particularly specialized backgrounds," David replied smoothly. The kind of backgrounds that are sometimes classified for reasons of national security? Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. David, this wasn't supposed to happen. I just wanted to shoot again, to remember what it felt like. I know, David replied, his expression softening slightly. But you know the rules, Marcus. You know why those rules exist? The warrant officer from SAS Selection had been listening carefully. So our palace guard really is regiment, he said. More statement than question. David looked at him with the measuring gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating what people needed to know. Let's just say that Private Thompson's previous service involved operations that remain classified. The sixth and final round was announced, but the attention of everyone on the range was now focused on the conversation between Marcus and the mysterious civilian. It was clear that Marcus's cover, maintained for 3 years, was now completely blown. A major from the Royal Green Jackets voiced what many were thinking. So what happens now? Does he go back to standing guard at the palace? Pretending this never happened? David considered this question carefully. He said, depends on several factors, not least of which is whether Private Thompson is ready to accept that his retirement might be over. Soldiers, who had mocked him that morning, now looked at him with respect and curiosity. His secret was out, his carefully constructed new identity shattered by his inability to resist the call of the rifle range. The final round, the range officer announced over the speakers, will be freestyle engagement. Shooters may use any position, any technique to engage targets at multiple ranges simultaneously. David looked at Marcus with raised eyebrows. One more round? He asked. Might as well finish what you started. Marcus realized that everything had changed. His quiet life as a royal guard was over. The question now was what would replace it, and whether he was ready to face that future as he prepared for the final round. Marcus Thompson knew that he was no longer shooting for sport or competition. He was shooting for his future, whatever that might hold. The final round represented the ultimate test of marksmanship. Freestyle engagement with targets at ranges from 100 to 1,000 meters, positioned at different elevations and angles. Competitors could choose their own shooting positions and techniques, but they had to engage all targets within a strict time limit. This was shooting as art form, combining technical skill, tactical thinking, and pure instinct. Marcus stood at the starting line, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of the ceremonial guard. His true nature had been revealed, and there was no going back. David stood nearby, watching with the interest of someone who had witnessed Marcus's skills in far more dangerous circumstances. You don't have to do this, David said quietly. Could walk away right now. Let's find you a different posting, maybe something less public. Marcus checked his rifle one final time, his movements now openly displaying the efficiency of advanced tactical training. No, he said. I've spent 3 years hiding who I am. If it's over, then let it be over completely. The first few competitors in the final round struggled with the complexity of the challenge. Multiple targets at vastly different ranges required. Constant adjustment of scope settings, shooting positions, and ballistic calculations. Even experienced snipers found themselves running out of time before engaging all targets. When the Marine sniper, the same one who had achieved high scores in earlier rounds, completed his attempt with a respectable but imperfect score, the crowd of watchers was reminded of just how difficult this final challenge was. Your turn, Marcus, David said. Using his first name for the first time that day, Marcus approached the firing line, and something extraordinary happened. The carefully controlled demeanor he had maintained throughout the competition fell away, completely. In its place was something that made several of the watching soldiers taken unconscious. Step backward. This wasn't just a skilled marksman preparing to shoot. This was a weapon being deployed. Marcus surveyed the range through his scope, quickly calculating angles, distances, and the sequence in which he would engage the targets. His breathing settled into the deep, controlled rhythm that had been burned into his nervous system through years of training that went far beyond what any of the watchers had experienced. The timer started, and Marcus began what could only be described as a demonstration of lethal artistry. He moved through shooting positions with fluid grace, engaging targets in a sequence that seemed random but was actually calculated for maximum efficiency. Transitions between prone, kneeling, and standing positions were so smooth they appeared choreographed. The first target,
At
200 meters, was eliminated with a shot that struck dead center. Without pause, he adjusted his scope and engaged a target at 800 meters. The long-range shot taken with the same casual precision as the closer one, but it was his technique that truly amazed the watching soldiers. This wasn't just accurate shooting. It was tactical shooting, refined to an art form. Marcus was demonstrating skills that took years to develop and could only be maintained through constant practice under operational conditions. "Jesus Christ," whispered the SBS sniper. "Look at his transitions. I've never seen anyone move like that." Marcus continued through the course, gauging targets at 1,000 meters with the same precision he used on closer ones. His scope adjustments were made by feel, without conscious calculation, suggesting a level of experience that went far beyond training. Halfway through the course, he switched to shooting from unconventional positions around barriers, from awkward angles, even from movement techniques that were clearly learned in operational environments where textbook shooting positions weren't always available. The warrant officer from SAS Selection was watching with professional appreciation. "That's not just regiment training," he said to David. "That's something beyond regiment." David's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of something that might have been pride in his eyes. "Marcus was always exceptional," he said quietly, "even among exceptional people." As Marcus neared the end of the course, it became clear that he wasn't just completing the challenge, he was making it look effortless. His final few shots were taken at extreme range and difficult angles, yet each one found its mark with precision. That seemed to defy physics. When the timer stopped, Marcus had engaged every target successfully. Many with shots that were better than perfect shots, that would have been instantly lethal in combat situations. The electronic scoring system took longer than usual to calculate the results, as if the computer was struggling to process what it had recorded. When the final score appeared, even the range officer seemed stunned. "Thompson, Royal Guard," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent range. "Perfect score, all targets eliminated, course completed in record time." But the score was almost irrelevant now. What the soldiers had witnessed was a display of skill that went beyond competition shooting. This was operational capability at the highest possible level, the kind that was developed through experiences that most of them could only imagine. The colonel, who had been questioning Marcus throughout the day, approached slowly, his expression now showing genuine awe. "Private Thompson," he said, "I've been in the military for 30 years. I've worked with the best shooters in the world. What you just did, that was beyond anything I've ever seen." Marcus set his rifle down carefully, his hands steady despite what he had just revealed about himself. For a moment he looked like he might say something, but then he simply nodded at the colonel's compliment. David stepped forward, addressing the gathered soldiers. "Gentlemen, what you've witnessed today was a demonstration by someone who served in capacities that remain classified, reasons of operational security. I'm going to have to ask that the details of Private Thompson's performance today remain." Within this group, the Intelligence Corps' captain nodded understanding. "Of course, but I think we all have questions about what happens next." Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying a finality that hadn't been there before. "What happens next is that I stop pretending to be someone I'm not." He looked around at the faces of the soldiers who had spent the morning mocking him. "You were right to question what I was doing here. I didn't belong in that red uniform, standing at palace gates, pretending that this part of me didn't exist." Young Corporal, who had been among the first to mock him, stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir," he said, using the honorific instinctively, despite Marcus's lower rank, "I owe you an apology." "We all do. We had no idea. .. Locus held up a hand, stopping him. "You had no way of knowing, that was the point. For 3 years I convinced myself that I could bury this part of who I am, that I could find peace in ceremony and tradition. But you can't run from what you are." The warrant officer from SAS Selection had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he stepped closer. "So what are you, Marcus? Really?" Marcus looked at David, who gave a slight nod. "I was SAS," Marcus said simply. "But more than that, I was part of operations that dot, dot. Let's just say they required a very specific skill set. Counterterrorism, asked the Marine major. Among other things, David answered for him. Marcus was involved in operations across multiple theaters, often working alone or in very small teams. The kind of work where missing a shot isn't just failure, it's catastrophic failure. The range had grown completely silent as the implications of this revelation settled over the gathered soldiers. They weren't just looking at a former Special Forces operator. They were looking at someone who had operated at the very top of that elite community. A young lieutenant from the Guards Division who had remained quiet throughout the day finally spoke. But why leave? Why give up that kind of work to become a ceremonial guard? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of experiences that most of them would never understand. Because there comes a point when you've seen enough, done enough, lost enough people, ... When you just want to find something peaceful, something clean. He gestured toward his red uniform, which now seemed almost costume-like, given what they knew about him. Standing guard at a palace, following centuries-old traditions. Being part of something stable and peaceful, it seemed like exactly what I needed, but it wasn't enough, David observed. No, Marcus admitted. It wasn't. You can't spend 15 years being one thing and then just switch it off. The skills don't go away. The instincts don't fade. And eventually, you need to remember who you really are. The colonel who had been questioning him throughout the day looked thoughtful. So what now? Do you go back to your old unit? Return to active operations? David and Marcus exchanged a look that spoke of conversations yet to come. That, David said, is something we'll need to discuss privately. But I think it's safe to say that Private Thompson's days as a ceremonial guard are over. Marcus began, gathering his equipment, movements that were now openly efficient and tactical. The other soldiers watched him with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and something approaching a awe as he prepared to leave. The young corporal who had apologized earlier approached him one more time. "It's her," he said. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus nodded. "What you did today, the way you shot, how long does it take to get that good?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "The shooting," he said, "that's just technique. You can learn that in a few years with proper training. But the part that lets you perform under pressure, that keeps you calm when everything is chaos, that comes from experience. The kind of experience you hope you never need." He shouldered his equipment bag, no longer the mild-mannered royal guard who had arrived that morning. The question you should be asking isn't how to get that good. It's whether you really want to pay the price that comes with it. With that, Marcus Thompson walked toward the range exit, followed by David. Behind them, they left a group of soldiers who would spend years talking about the day they discovered that the quiet royal guard they had mocked was actually one of the most dangerous men any of them had ever encountered. The competition was over. But for Marcus, something new was about to begin. After 3 years of hiding from his past, he was finally ready to face his future, whatever that might hold. 3 months after the shooting competition, Marcus Thompson sat in a nondescript office building in central London, wearing civilian clothes and holding a cup of tea that had gone cold while he read through classified briefings. The red uniform of the Royal Guard hung in a closet at his flat, a reminder of 3 years spent trying to be someone he wasn't. David sat across from him, looking through personnel files and operational reports. The transition back to active duty had been smoother than either of them had expected, though it had required extensive debriefing and psychological evaluation to ensure Marcus was ready to return to operational status. "The situation in Eastern Europe requires someone with your particular skills," David explained, sliding a folder across the desk. "High-value target, extremely difficult approach, limited time window, the kind of operation you use to specialize." Marcus opened the folder and studied the contents with professional interest. After 3 years of ceremonial duties, the prospect of real operational work felt both familiar and strange. Team operation or solo? Solo initially. If you can get eyes on target and confirm the intelligence, we'll discuss extraction options. But the infiltration and reconnaissance phase, needs someone who can operate independently for extended periods. This was exactly the kind of work Marcus had done before joining the Guards Complex. Dangerous operations that required not just technical skill, but mental resilience and operational flexibility. The kind of work that had eventually driven him to seek the peace of ceremonial duty? "I have to ask," Marcus said, closing the folder. "Are you sure I'm ready for this?" 3 years is a long time to be away from operational work. David smiled, the expression carrying memories of the shooting competition that had ended Marcus's retirement. "After what you demonstrated at that range, I don't think anyone questions your readiness. The muscle memory is still there. The skills are still sharp. The question is whether you want to use them again." Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the London street below. Ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the conversations that took place. In buildings like this one, conversations that sometimes determined their safety and security. "I spent 3 years trying to convince myself that I could be normal," he said, "that I could find satisfaction in routine, in ceremony, in being just another face in a crowd. But that morning, at the range, when I picked up that rifle again, I remembered who you really are," David finished. "More than that," Marcus replied. "I remembered why it matters, why someone has to do this work, even when it costs everything." He turned back to face David, and his expression had changed. Gone was any trace of the uncertainty that had marked his transition period. In its place was the quiet confidence of a professional returning to his calling. "There's something else," David said, his tone becoming more serious. "The competition you participated inward has gotten around certain circles, or people who have taken notice of your demonstration. This sounded like the kind of complication that could make operations more difficult." "Friendly interest, mostly," David continued. "Other agencies, allied services, people who appreciate exceptional talent when they see it. But also some less friendly attention. Your cover identity as a simple royal guard protected you for 3 years. That protection is gone now. Meaning, I'm a target. Meaning you're known," David replied. "In our line of work, those are often the same thing." Marcus considered this information. He had always known that returning to operational status would eliminate the anonymity he had enjoyed as a ceremonial guard. But he had underestimated how completely his display at the shooting competition would shatter that protection. "The Eastern Europe operation," he said, returning to the folder. "Is this related to the attention you mentioned?" David's expression became carefully neutral. "Let's just say that there are parties who would be very interested in preventing this particular operation from succeeding. Your participation adds both capability and risk to the mission." This was the reality Marcus had forgotten during his 3 years of peace. Every operation existed within layers of complexity, where success depended not just on individual skill, but on navigating political, military, and intelligence considerations. That could shift without warning. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. David's assistant entered, carrying another file marked with security classifications that made even the previous briefing look routine. "Sir," the assistant said, "the situation has developed. We need to move the timeline forward significantly." David opened the new file, his expression growing more serious as he read. "Marcus," he said, "it appears your first operation back may be more challenging than we anticipated." Marcus felt something stirring in his chest, not fear, but anticipation. The adrenaline response that had been dormant for 3 years was awakening again. How challenging! It's a kind that requires immediate deployment and complete autonomy in the field. The kind where you'll be entirely on your own, with no backup and no extraction guarantee. This was exactly the type of operation Marcus had excelled at during his active years, high-risk missions that required not just technical skill, but the mental toughness to operate in complete isolation under extreme stress. "When do I leave?" he asked. David checked his watch. "Transport leaves in 4 hours. Full briefing en route. Out on her once you're deployed. Communication will be minimal and irregular." Marcus stood, already mentally shifting into operational mode. The transformation was remarkable. The mild-mannered guard who had stood quietly at palace gates was gone completely. replaced by something harder and more focused. "David," he said as he prepared to leave for his equipment preparation, "thank you for what? For not letting me stay hidden? For understanding that some people aren't meant for peaceful lives?" David nodded. "Just remember, Marcus, you chose to come back to this. When things get difficult out there, when you're alone and everything goes wrong, remember that this was your choice." As Marcus left the office building, he realized that his journey had come full circle. 3 years ago, he had been a burned-out operative seeking peace and ceremonial duty. Today, he was returning to the world he had tried to leave behind, but this time with a clearer understanding of who he was and why his skills mattered. The shooting competition had been intended as a simple demonstration of marksmanship. Instead, it had become the catalyst for his return to operational duty. The soldiers who had mocked him that morning had unknowingly witnessed the resurrection of one of the military's most capable assets. 4 hours later, as his transport lifted off from a military airfield outside London, Marcus Thompson looked down at the city below and felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced in 3 years. He was no longer hiding from his nature or pretending to be someone else. He was going back to work, back to the dangerous and necessary operations that only a few people could handle. The quiet Royal Guard was gone forever. But in his place was something far more valuable, a professional who had remembered why his skills existed and was ready to use them again. The mockery he had endured at the shooting range had led to this moment, and for that, he was grateful. Sometimes it took others questioning who you were to remind you of who you really should be. As the aircraft climbed toward its operational altitude, Marcus opened his mission briefing and began preparing. For the work that defined him, he was finally home.